Сайн байцгаана уу хүнд үзэгчдээ. Өнөөдөр орой манай de facto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Станфордын сургуулийн профессор Larry Diamond оролцож байна.
Larry Diamond тэрээр ардчилал хөгжил ба хуулийг дээдлэх төвийн захирлын алба хашдаг. Diamond Америк нэгдсэн улсын төрийн департамент, нэгдсэн үндэсний байгууллага, Дэлхийн банк болон Америк нэгдсэн улсын олон улсын хөгжлийн агентлаг зэрэг төр засгийн болоод олон улсын нэр хүндтэй байгууллагуудад зөвлөхөөр ажиллаж байсан. Diamond 2004 онд Иракийн шилжилтийн засгийн газарт ахлах зөвлөхөөр өргөдөн ажиллаж байлаа. Ардчлалын боловсролыг түгээн дэлгэрүүлэх, хүмүүст ардчлалын үн цэнийг таниулахын төлөө оруулсан олон жилийн хүч хөдөлмөр хувь нэмрийг нь үнэлж, Larry Diamond-ыг 2007 онд Америк нэгдсэн улсын Станфордын их сургууль оны тэргүүний багшаар тодруулж байжээ.
Good evening.
Nice to be with you.
Welcome to Mongolia.
Thank you.
You have a great mission. You are a delegate of this Conference of Community of Democracies. Please tell us about briefly how do you see that conference? Is it what you were expecting or some?
Yes, it is what I was expecting and even more because this conference and the presidency of Mongolia during the last 2 years of the Community of Democracies has really moved this association of democracies of the world forward, institutionalizing the organization, deepening partnerships to advance democracy in particular places like Tunisia and Moldova, and promoting the values of democracy through education for democracy and a number of other concrete initiatives to strengthen governance in democracies and improve the transparency and accountability of democracy. So I think the conference is making a great deal of progress both in advancing and defending the goals of democracy and building up the solidarity and practical organization of this community of democracies.
You were here before with Professor Fukuyama, and you three of you gave a lecture about democracy, market economy to our audience, and it's about 6 months or so ago, right?
August of last year.
Almost August, yes.
8 months ago.
8 months ago, and now this country is moving very fast. How do you see so far the progress, in particular, in just before the president election here?
Well, I think that sometimes it's useful to look at independent information. And one source of independent information is the annual ratings of Transparency International. And Transparency International recorded at the end of last year in its ratings that Mongolia had made in the past year the fastest progress in improving transparency and in combating corruption of any country that it surveyed. And I think there's a general sense here that there is an effort underway to make government work better and to try and address some of the problems of rule of law and corruption that still threaten the quality, and possibly we shouldn't take it for granted, even the survival of democracy in Mongolia. So I think some of the reforms that are on the table of the criminal justice system and the efforts to make the judicial system work better and to improve government transparency are really very important to the future both of democracy and of development in Mongolia. It's very important to keep in mind that if you don't have transparent government and if you don't control corruption, it's very hard not only to have justice in the elementary sense, but also to ensure that the fruits of development are broadly distributed among the people. And we know from much comparative experience that this is a particular challenge in countries that are blessed or cursed, depending on your perspective, with natural resource wealth.
Burma leader Aung San Suu Kyi said that the ultimate measure of democracy, not the democracy itself, but this is not, I'm not quoting her here, my words, but she said, it is how does it make a change in daily life of ordinary people? In that sense, how do you see Mongolia?
I'm not in the best position to judge how ordinary people are doing in terms of the quality of their lives. And it's very hard to measure because we get aggregate measures of gross national income. So we know that Mongolia is recording now stratospheric rates of economic growth, 14%. I mean, who even hears of this in the world these days? And of course, driven by the great bounty of natural resource wealth that's coming to the country. But we have to worry about distribution and social justice. I think that is a very important part of what Aung San Suu Kyi was saying, in fact, to the community of democracies this morning, that we need not only democracy, but democracy that delivers for the people. I think there's a government here that's trying, but there are a lot of needs in terms of public infrastructure, in terms of roads, education, public health, and so on. These are the challenges, the great challenges of development that lie in front of the government of Mongolia.
That's exactly the ordinary people are waiting from the value democracy, if it is strengthening in this country, if it really works as our delegates are describing, and people still in terms of freedom of right, freedom of press, speech, and then we are enjoying that freedom. But now they want to see that this growth
Delivery.
of 14% comes to every home,
Yeah.
the delivery. So here I think our government has a lot of things to improve, and they are working now.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote a book called The Spirit of Democracy,
Mm-hmm.
and a very well-known book, and you said in 74, 1/3 of the world were under, countries in the world were under dictatorship. But after 3 decades, only half of them are now free economy. And you also said that a country like China, within a generation, can be a democratic. What do you mean?
Well, yeah, back in 1974 when the third wave of democratization started, most countries in the world were authoritarian, probably at least 2/3, and now, as you said, at least half of those have made transitions to democracy. In the case of China, of course, it's the biggest non-democratic country in the world, but it's also been the most rapidly modernizing country in the world. And we do know from much comparative evidence that there is a relationship between economic development and democracy, that as economic development happens, and particularly if it's broadly distributed, people's values change. They don't just want a washing machine and a car and better food and housing and consumer goods. They also yearn for freedom. And we know from much social science research that there's a change in the psychology of individuals with economic development. They want more autonomy. They don't want to be dictated to. And they want more say in their own affairs. And I think we're seeing now with the presence of rising mass protest, with the Chinese government itself is reporting hundreds, if not thousands, of mass incidents a day in which people at local levels are protesting because some Communist Party official at the local level has seized people's land or committed some other corrupt act that has deprived people of their economic and political rights, including their property rights. And I think that the Chinese Communist Party now is in a very interesting and delicate dilemma. The president of China, Xi Jinping, I think understands that reform is needed. Reform to improve the rule of law, reform to make government more accountable, reform to address the rising level of grievances people have about injustices, the weakness of the rule of law, corruption, abuse of human rights, and of course the horrific state of China's environment with the It's air pollution and water pollution reaching levels that are really damaging its development and human well-being. But I think the top Chinese leadership fears that if they start to open up, if they introduce what Gorbachev called perestroika and glasnost, that their ability to control the situation may unravel. And the Chinese leadership is consumed with a great fear that if they introduce political reform and political opening, they will wind up like Gorbachev, basically being displaced. But I think the reality is that if they don't introduce reform, they're going to wind up like Gorbachev, that popular protest is going to reach a point in some new moment of ecological crisis, natural disaster, economic crisis. They have very big problems now with their residential housing sector. There's a very big bubble in the real estate, residential real estate sector in China. So if they don't move, at least incrementally, to introduce more rule of law, more political voice, more accountability, to separate the party from the legislature, to separate the party from the civil service, and most of all, to separate the party from the judiciary, this is just not going to be sustainable, because people's values and expectations and frustrations are growing in China, and they want more political accountability.
Very interesting. Either the political system now, they introduce that openness, this democracy themselves, or they will be forced to introduce it.
I think that if they're really forced to, it will be too late, and the whole system will come crashing down. So I think that the only way for communist rule to survive is to move in a much more liberal, open, and rule of law direction. And though I'm a very strong advocate of democracy and human rights, I actually would rather see an incremental process of political change in China. Because I think that it will produce a more sustainable democracy, as in Taiwan. Whereas if the system comes crashing down suddenly, I worry that there could be great political instability in China, the rise of nationalism and maybe even military rule in China to fill the vacuum. This would be more dangerous for regional peace. It would be more dangerous for political and economic well-being in China. And I think we've seen that if democracy happens more gradually, to build the rule of law institutions, to build up a strong judiciary, to generate a political culture of participation, to gradually allow opposition parties to emerge and take root, then the institutions and values can accumulate more gradually and develop more capacity and sink deeper roots. Whereas if the system all just collapses at once, it's going to be really hard to build a viable democracy in the near term.
Speaking about our neighbor, Russia, which had the Soviet Union, which had introduced perestroika and the end of the Cold War, but today, after 20 years, 23, 4 years, how do you see the democracy in Russia?
Well, I think Vladimir Putin strangled democracy in Russia soon after assuming the presidency in the early 2000s, and it hasn't recovered from that. I think that Russia is in a state of deepening authoritarianism. Putin has reassumed the presidency with no more liberal intention or mind than when he was president before. There's been intimidating crackdown that's been continuing on associational freedom, on freedom of expression. You see him prosecuting one prominent political opponent after another. Now, a person who sought the presidency against him, Navalny, is his latest target. And it's really, frankly, a very deeply worrisome and distressing situation that one man could so powerfully dominate the government, the political system, the security apparatus, and so on. And this is not doing any good for Russia's development and its social justice. The country is still overwhelmingly dependent on oil and gas, and foreign investment is not coming into other sectors because there's no rule of law. And unless you have a more open, transparent, law-based state and a greater climate of protection for human rights and property rights, investment is not going to come in, and Russia is not going to realize its economic potential.
Both our neighbors have our neighbors been to previous Community of Development conferences? Because they are not here now.
Not China. China's never been to a Community of Democracies meeting. At least Russia has some of the outward or formal institutions of democracy. At least Russia was a democracy in the not too distant past, and you know, it has had at least competitive multi-party elections. But China is a one-party communist state, and you know, it would be a joke to have the People's Republic of China at a meeting of the Community of Democracies. It has no interest in coming, and the community, you know, has a very different agenda. So China has never been at one of these meetings. Russia has attended in the past, and obviously I guess it sent a message by not being here this time.
In Lithuania, last 2 years ago, if they were Russian delegation?
I believe so. I can't say for sure.
From 2 years now, today, I mean, as we speak, that president or chairmanship of this community of the conference will be, democracy will be moving now to El Salvador, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
so in 2 years from now, there will be another landmark step in the development of democracy. And you were writing in your book interesting terminology called liberation technology.
Mm-hmm.
Please explain what is this about.
Liberation technology is about those tools that are sitting on your counter here. The phone, you know, the digital phone, the iPad or smart pads, and all the other tools, the internet, the mobile platforms that increasingly empower people, the social media, Twitter, Facebook, and so on, and the ability of these tools to empower individuals, to amplify their voices, to facilitate communication, organization, networking for human rights, for democracy, for economic development. These tools have enabled people in authoritarian situations like Tunisia and Egypt to organize protests and bring people out and spread messages. In Malaysia, you've got an election coming up on May 5th in Malaysia where the ruling party coalition of the last half a century may be defeated. And one of the things that has helped to level the playing field in Malaysia over the last number of years, given the tight control of the established press by the ruling party in Malaysia, is an online newspaper called Malaysia Kini that a lot of Malaysians are reading. So all of these are examples of people and organizations, journalists and entrepreneurs, the emergence of a large number of bloggers who are not accepting the status quo, but using these tools of empowerment, of digital empowerment, to generate new sources of information, to expose wrongdoing, to express their opinions, to organize and mobilize. And there's a whole element of this technology that has helped to make markets work better, to improve public health.
You have also been said that for democratic recessions in several countries, things are happening because of not enough transparency in the government, which creates or makes conditions for corruption, and which makes deteriorating the rule of law. That you have been explaining, and that's why you said also the strengthening of institutions for political and financial accountability. Could you elaborate that a little bit?
Well, I think, first of all, as I said in my remarks here at the Community of Democracies, we need to acknowledge a very sobering fact. 1/3 of all the democracies that have existed over the last 40 years in this third wave of democratization have failed. And if you just look at the democracies outside the stable democracies of the West, it's around 40%. So that's a pretty high failure rate. Then if you look at why these democracies are failing, I'd say one of the most common reasons, if not the most common and powerful reason, is bad governance, is the politicians, the parties, government ministers using the state to enrich and empower themselves and allow the advantaging of special interests, corrupt interests, rather than serving the public good. So if you don't make government more transparent and more accountable...
How to make it?
Huh?
How to make it? How to make sure
Oh,
that
there's so many things that can be done. First of all, transparency in government finances and budgeting. So we have the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which Mongolia is a part of, which says that all of the mining and oil companies of the world, when they come in, should publish what they pay, publish all of the payments they make, the royalties that are paid to the government and so on, so that government income from mining is transparent. Everyone knows how much money the government has, so
yeah, but
if
on
it
one
disappears...
hand, we know, for example, our government, previous government, have been receiving money for prepayment of coal they're supposed to send, and they have used that. By the way, all the state-owned companies here, Erdenet company, it's a joint venture with Russia, state-owned. Tavan Tolgoi coal company, also state-owned. 10% they say public owns, but we don't see our presence on the board. And the third is also Yu Tolgoi. They have been always receiving prepayment, and that through Human Development Fund they are channeling, and they were misusing it. They were using it actually for political campaign. They have been sort of paying what they have promised. And so we know where the money is channeling, how to stop it, how. Because this don't go to the company.
So that's the first step is knowledge, the transparency that can generate information and knowledge. The second step is acting on that knowledge. Now, if the people have the information, one thing they can do is punish at the polls those political leaders, parties, whoever they may be, who are responsible for corrupt or non-transparent governance.
At the election.
At the election. But there needs to be what I call horizontal accountability. That is one portion of the government holding another accountable. And for this, I just cannot emphasize enough the importance of a truly independent, truly professional judiciary. And so judicial reform is a very, very important priority for a developing democracy, to create a more professional and meritocratic judiciary that's insulated from political influences and insulated from corruption, and then that can be disciplined and punished if it is tempted by corruption. And then this requires a strong anti-corruption apparatus.
Do you think, for example, in case of Mongolia, our judiciary system fully controlled by one person, who is a president, and this person may replace, change, nominate people there? Is it fair? Or
the ideal system, I'd say the ideal system that you want to get to is one where over time you develop what's called a Judicial Service Commission that's insulated from political control, that consists of people who are not tied to parties, maybe law professors and distinguished retired judges who are seen to have done a good job, and that these people then are responsible for appointing at least most of the judges of the country, with the possible exception of the Constitutional Court, and for the training and promotion of judges on the basis of merit. I think this is a good system for an emerging democracy to look at. And of course, you have a semi-presidential system here where the president is not exercising day-to-day control over government. So in that kind of system, a president can be potentially more of a neutral arbiter or more concerned about the quality of governance. But there has to be some checks and balances, I think, where ultimately you get to a system where this becomes professionalized and depoliticized. Wow.
Then that means how we can control that unbiasedness of that one person today or tomorrow by our Constitution?
Well, what people need to remember is that if you have a good person in a powerful role one day, you may not have such a good and honest person the next day.
That's what I mean.
And so this is why, in the long run, people who want to see the strengthening of democracy need to put their faith in institutions and not just in individuals. And so building up independent institutions of accountability is a very important priority for deepening democracy.
Larry, please tell us about the CDDRL.
Well, CDDRL is the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University that I direct. And it's a research center that seeks to understand how democracy develops and takes root and what the relationship is to the rule of law, to human rights, to good governance, and of course to economic development. And more generally, how countries move from conditions of poverty or being economically behind in development to more dynamic, prosperous, and broadly distributed development. And we're not only a research institution, we're also very interested in policy and advancing these goals and advancing public understanding, which is why 3 of us were here in Mongolia last summer lecturing on these issues, and which is why every year we have a summer fellows program, the Draper Hills program, that brings mid-career professionals from around the world for 3 weeks to come to Stanford and debate and discuss and think about these issues.
Oh, you said, well, in that context, from how to get from poverty to a dynamic economy, Mongolia is one of few countries, I understand, who is doing the political and economic transition at the same time. Its challenges on 2 fronts. Is it getting well? From your perspective, what we can improve?
Well, it's not one of the few. There are actually quite a number that are wrestling with this challenge now. And I think it would be a bit arrogant of me to give you a long, detailed list of my opinions. But in talking to Mongolians I respect, they certainly think that some of the priorities are civic education to strengthen democratic knowledge, skills, and the values of democratic citizenship.
That civic education would be done by state or by the public?
Both, by the state and by civil society.
Okay.
So the curriculum of civic education needs to be incorporated into the public school system, but civil society organizations and all their work, women's organizations, youth organizations, community groups, need to also be distributing these lessons of democratic citizenship. Secondly, judicial reform, I think, is extremely important, as I've said, and many people in civil society have noted that. And related to that, there's a very broad sense in Mongolia that despite the progress that's been made, there are still serious problems of corruption. And with all the money coming in from the mining interests, and from powerful external actors, let's leave it at that, who have interest in seeing certain policies and development decisions made, the temptations are very strong. So I would underscore the kind of rule of law and good governance challenges as a very key priority for enabling Mongolia not to just realize rapid economic growth, because what the country wants, what any country wants, is not just rapid economic growth, but rapid economic growth that, as you said at the beginning of our conversation, lifts up people's lives, improves their human well-being, their health, the opportunities for their kids to go to college, the quality of their living circumstances, their roads, their water, their sanitation, and so on, not only in the urban areas, but out in the countryside.
And these require so many public institutions working properly.
Exactly.
Insurance,
working properly,
pension.
with capacity, with professionalism, and honesty and transparency.
And as an economist, in Mongolia, we mostly based on, our capital is based on the money market, not capital market. And we have a problem with capital market on the issue of trust. People don't trust much. What is the best to change?
I think that if you get the institutions right, the investors will come. So getting a good investment law that will create clear, stable, facilitating rules for both domestic and foreign investment is a very important priority. And having a climate in which people can know that government is going to make decisions and make investments based on the well-being of the country rather than the interests of particular individuals in government or in politics, that's going to build up trust. It's going to build up trust between the Mongolian government and the people, and it's going to build up trust between the Mongolian government and foreign and domestic investors.
Now we are close to the end of the interview. Just some few personal questions on when you have decided to study specifically this democracy issue, to devote so much time. Why? When and why?
When? Probably when I was a very young boy. I was very inspired by John F. Kennedy in the United States. I was 9 years old when he was elected president, and that represented a kind of new awakening for the United States and a call not only to defend freedom in the world, but to improve freedom and civil rights at home. And this inspired me to want to be in public service, and I think kindled really a lifelong interest in democracy and public service.
And you went to a particular school for that?
Well, for a while I was still in grade school, and then I went to Stanford University. I got a degree, a self-designed major in political organization and behavior, so I'm a very political person. A PhD in sociology. I went and taught in Tennessee for 5 years at Vanderbilt University, and I returned to Stanford in 1985 at the Hoover Institution, which, as you know, is a very prominent think tank in the United States devoted to the advancement of economic and political freedom. And I've been at Stanford ever since, while also being an activist on these issues and working with the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C., and co-editing its journal, the Journal of Democracy.
That's the second question I want to ask you about the Journal of Democracy. Is it what you are covering all around the world, democracy in general, or challenges of democracy?
We are a quarterly journal. Every quarter we put at least 2 or 3 of our articles online for free. So your viewers can see more about the Journal of Democracy by simply going to www.journalofdemocracy, all one word, .org.
Have you been ever reflecting Mongolia?
Huh?
Have you been ever reflecting situation?
Of course,
in Mongolia
yes.
in
We've
your
published
journal?
articles on Mongolia.
On Mongolia.
And the most recent one, which was some years ago, but took, I'd say, quite respectful note of the achievements that Mongolia has made in becoming a democracy in rather unlikely circumstances.
You know, my last question, with the current all circumstances and the double transition, economic, political, and the dynamics happening here, how do you see Mongolia 10 years from now?
I think this country is at a potential turning point if it uses the great natural resource wealth that God has given it to invest in people and raise their levels of education and enable them to use information technology to compete in the world. and improve their physical well-being, again, in terms of health, education, roads, sanitation, physical infrastructure. This country 10 years from now will be an astonishing success story. It will be a dynamic, upper middle income country with great prospects. And if it doesn't use the natural resource wealth effectively in this way, it could slide down a very tragic path toward worse governance, more political polarization, more extreme social divisions, and more political instability. So I think the next decade is absolutely crucial in shaping the long-term future of Mongolia.
That's exactly, I think, all Mongolians think today, and we are very determined to go on the first path, what you're describing.
I wish you luck in that endeavor.
So we'll meet you in 10 years, and let's see.
I look forward.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you very much.